1177 BC, the year the world fell apart, Part 1. When the world was perfect. What if I told you there was a time when the ancient world was more connected than ours is today? A time when kings didn't just know each other's names. They exchanged gifts, married their children into each other's courts, and called one another brother. A time when ships crossed glittering seas, carrying gold, ivory, and rare spices. And yet, within a single lifetime, this dazzling web of civilizations collapsed into dust. Could the same thing happen to us? Before we dive in, if you love exploring the hidden truths of history, the stories your textbooks barely touch, make sure to subscribe to Obscure Truths. Not just to support this channel, but to join a journey into the past that might just change the way you see the present. A world at its peak, the Late Bronze Age. Roughly 1550–1200 BC was the golden age of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. If you could stand atop the palace walls of Mycenae, today in the Peloponnese region of Greece, and look toward the horizon, you would be gazing at a world unlike any before it. Egypt, modern-day Egypt, under its new kingdom pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramses II, was wealthy beyond imagination. The Hittite Empire, modern-day Turkey and part of Syria, dominated Anatolia with armies clad in shining bronze. The Mycenaeans of Greece controlled the Aegean Sea, building fortresses such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. In the Levant, modern Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, Canaanite city-states like Megiddo and Byblos flourished. On the island of Crete, Greece, the legacy of the Minoans still echoed through the grand halls of Knossos. The web of trade and diplomacy. Picture the Mediterranean as a shimmering spider's web. Each knot in the web was a thriving city. Hattusa, modern Boğazkale, Turkey, the Hittite capital. Thebes, modern Luxor, Egypt, Egypt's religious center. Knossos, Crete, Greece, heart of Minoan culture. Ugarit, modern Ras Shamra, Syria, a bustling trade port. Troy, modern Hisarlik, Turkey, strategic link between the Aegean and Black Sea. Ships carried copper from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from Nubia, modern Sudan. Without copper and tin, there would be no bronze, no swords, no armor, no plows, no chariots. The Amarna letters, around 1350 BC, discovered in Tel El Amarna, Egypt, reveal that rulers of this age called each other brother. This was not a fragile alliance. It was a robust diplomatic system that had endured for centuries. Life in the cities. In Mycenae, artisans shaped gold into funeral masks, like the famous Mask of Agamemnon. In Ugarit, markets overflowed with dates, wine, and fragrant oils. In Egypt, monumental temples like Karnak and Luxor rose along the Nile, their walls carved with scenes of pharaohs smiting enemies. But in truth, the borders were stable. People lived with confidence. Farmers worked fertile fields, trusting that trade would bring them the tools and luxuries they could not make themselves. Priests performed elaborate rituals to maintain Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. The fragile foundation, and yet, beneath the splendor lay fragility. If tin from the east, Afghanistan, Anatolia, stopped flowing, bronze production would halt. If a major port like Ugarit or Byblos fell, the goods it moved could not be easily rerouted. Complex systems look unshakable until one link breaks. A whisper from the past. In the ruins of Ugarit, Ras Shamra, Syria, archaeologists discovered an unsent letter written around 1190 BC. The enemy's ships are already here. My cities are burning. I do not know what to do. It survived thanks to the very fire that destroyed the city. And here's the chilling part. It wasn't written at the end of the collapse. It was written near the beginning. The first sparks of disaster came far earlier than most imagine. Mini cliffhanger. The Late Bronze Age looked perfect until it wasn't. Grain prices rose slightly. Ships arrived late. A neighbor failed to send their annual tribute. Small cracks in the foundation. Easy to ignore, yet each one a warning. The question is, who or what would strike the first blow to shatter this golden web? In Part 2, we'll peel back the layers and explore the first cracks that weakened the Bronze Age world. How climate shifts, Earthquakes, internal unrest, and unseen threats began to shake a civilization that seemed invincible. If you've enjoyed stepping into this lost world with me, hit subscribe so you won't miss the moment when the first domino falls. History doesn't just tell us where we've been, it warns us about where we might be headed. Part 2. The first cracks in the foundation. Every empire believes it will last forever, until the cracks begin to show. But in the late Bronze Age, those cracks didn't just widen, they shattered the very foundations of the known world. What if the warning signs were there all along and no one paid attention? If you've been following our journey into the golden web of the late Bronze Age, you'll know how connected, wealthy, and powerful this world seemed. But beauty can hide decay. And in today's episode, we're going to trace the first fractures, subtle at first, that began the slow, unstoppable unraveling. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Obscure Truths. That way, you won't miss the moment when the first domino falls and everything changes. A subtle shift in the winds. Approximately 1250 BC. Around the mid-13th century BC, something began to change. At first, it was barely noticeable. A longer dry season here, a mist shiknet there. But when we stitch the clues together, a pattern emerges. In Egypt, inscriptions from the reign of Ramses II, 1279 to 1213 BC, still boast of victory and prosperity. Yet, papyri from the same period record rising grain prices along the Nile. The annual flood, which fed Egypt for millennia, began to falter in some years. In Anatolia, the Hittite capital Hattusa, modern Boğazkale, Turkey, received reports from vassal states of poor harvests and dwindling tribute. Letters from rulers in Canaan, modern Israel and Lebanon, began to hint at food shortages. It wasn't just bad weather, something larger was brewing. The invisible enemy, climate change. Modern studies of pollen and sediment from sites like the Sea of Galilee, Israel, and Lake Larnaca, Cyprus, suggest a shift toward arid conditions starting around 1250 BC. Crops failed and pastures withered. Back then, there was no global food reserve, no emergency import plan. If your harvest failed, you starved, unless your neighbors could spare grain. But in a tightly interconnected world, when one region suffered, others soon followed. Tremors beneath the earth. The late Bronze Age world also sat atop one of the most seismically active regions in history. The eastern Mediterranean is riddled with fault lines, and between 1225 to 1175 BC, archaeological evidence shows widespread earthquake destruction. Mycenae and Tiryns, Greece suffered collapsed walls. Coastal cities like Bucharest, Syria show signs of seismic damage before being rebuilt and then destroyed again. Knossos, Crete, had already faced earthquakes in earlier centuries. New tremors weakened infrastructure. An earthquake alone might not topple a civilization, but combined with famine and political strain, it could be devastating. The strain of dependence trade, routes began to falter. The copper from Cyprus, vital for bronze, sometimes failed to arrive. Tin from as far as Afghanistan or Anatolia became scarce. Without these metals, armies could not produce new weapons, and farmers couldn't replace worn tools. The late Bronze Age economy was a marvel, but it had no plan B. Break the chain and the whole system trembled. Letters of desperation, 1230 BC. One letter from the city of Byblos, modern Lebanon, to Egypt pleads for grain, warning that the people are dying. Another from a Hittite governor complains that merchants are refusing to sail because of piracy, or perhaps more ominous threats at sea. These letters were the ancient equivalent of red alert emails. But in an age where communication could take weeks, by the time help arrived, it might already be too late. Internal fault lines. While nature and trade tested the system from without, internal politics began to crack it from within. In Mycenaean Greece, competition between city-states was fierce. Each palace, Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, vied for dominance, and alliances were fragile. If your neighbor suffered famine, it was easier to raid than to help. In the Hittite Empire, distant provinces in Syria grew restless. tempted by Egyptian influence or independence. Maintaining far-flung borders consumed resources the core territories could no longer spare. Mini cliffhanger, the unseen storm. By the late 13th century BC, the late Bronze Age world was under pressure from all sides. Failing harvests, earthquakes and natural disasters, choking trade routes, political unrest. And yet, for the most part, people carried on as if nothing was wrong. Palaces still held banquets. Temples still rang with hymns. The illusion of stability held. But out beyond the horizon, forces were gathering, forces that would not only test the system, but bring it crashing down. And they were coming from the sea. In Part 3, we'll meet the mysterious sea peoples, raiders, migrants, or desperate refugees, whose arrival would forever change the course of history. Were they invaders bent on conquest, or survivors of an earlier collapse seeking new homes? The truth is far stranger than legend. Make sure you're subscribed to Obscure Truths so you won't miss the moment when the first wave lands and the ancient world begins to burn. Part 3. The Sea Peoples arrive. They came from the sea, and no one knew who they were. No kings, no country, no clear homeland. But by the time they left, nothing was the same. Were they ruthless conquerors or desperate survivors seeking a place to live? If you followed the first 2 parts, you know the late Bronze Age world had already begun to crack. Famine, earthquakes, collapsing trade. Today, we witness the true storm, rising from the sea. Shadows on the horizon, c. 1200 BC. By the end of the 13th century BC, coastal cities in the Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria began receiving reports of strange fleets. Larger ships, heavier hulls, traveling in tight, coordinated groups. They weren't the familiar merchants from Cyprus or Crete. No flags, no diplomatic messages, just dark silhouettes approaching, and when they landed, fires lit the sky. Ugarit, modern Ras Shamra, Syria, a major trade hub, received warning letters from its allies, but there was no time to prepare. When the attackers came, the city was burned to the ground. In the ashes, archaeologists later found human remains, shattered weapons, and half-finished goods. Whom were the Sea Peoples? Egyptian records, especially at Medinet Habu, Luxor, Egypt, call them the Sea Peoples. The temple walls list groups with names like Shurdan, Shekelesh, Peweset, Denyen, and Cheker. Each name hints at a different origin. Anatolia, the Aegean, even Cyprus. No one is certain. Some historians believe they were a coalition of peoples displaced by the very climate shifts and conflicts we explored in Part 2. In other words, they might have been the product, not the initial cause, of the collapse. A Mediterranean in flames, 1200 to 1177 BC. From about 1200 to 1177 BC, the Sea Peoples swept across the region. Cyprus was raided, cutting off the main source of copper. Byblos and Sidon, modern Lebanon, were burned. Ashkelon and Gaza, modern-day Palestine, changed hands multiple times. And they didn't just come to plunder. They brought families, women, children, livestock. Clear signs they were seeking new homes, not just spoils. The decisive battle, Ramses III and Egypt. Around 1177 BC, Egypt under Ramses III stood as one of the last great powers still intact. When the Sea Peoples entered the Nile Delta, Ramses prepared to meet them with both navy and infantry. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict a brutal naval battle. Egyptian oared ships surrounding the invaders, archers raining arrows from above, infantry lying in wait along the riverbanks to cut down those who made it to shore. Egypt won, but at a cost. The victory drained resources, and the kingdom emerged weakened. While Egypt and a few cities managed to resist, many scholars believe the Sea Peoples weren't simply raiders. They may have been migrants from already collapsed regions, Mycenae, Anatolia, Cyprus, driven by hunger and the loss of their homelands. If so, the invasion was in reality a massive refugee crisis, and the fighting was the inevitable result of a strained world pushed past its limits. After the waves of Sea Peoples, ports lay in ruins. International trade nearly ceased. No copper from Cyprus, no tin from the east, no economy to sustain vast empires. Cities unable to feed themselves began to fall, one after another, and when one civilization collapsed, it pulled others down with it. In Part 4, we'll witness the terrifying domino effect. Great cities like Mycenae, Hattusa, and Ugarit disappearing forever. In a world bound together by mutual dependence, the fall of one was the doom of all. Subscribe to Obscure Truths so you won't miss the moment when the golden web of the Late Bronze Age finally turns to ash. Part 4. Dominoes falling, Ugarit burns, Mycenae falls, Hattusa is abandoned. City after city, gone. What happens when the pillars of a world collapse one by one? In the Late Bronze Age, the fall of one civilization wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the start of a chain reaction that would erase an entire era. If you've watched our journey so far, you know the cracks had been spreading for decades. Climate shifts, earthquakes, collapsing trade, and the arrival of the Sea Peoples. Now, the great powers will fall, not in isolation, but in a cascade that sweeps away everything in its path. Ugarit, the Silent Port, section 1190 BC. The fall began in earnest with Ugarit, modern Ras Shamra, Syria. Once a jewel of Levantine trade, its warehouses overflowed with goods from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Aegean. But when the Sea Peoples arrived, the city was caught unprepared. Archaeologists found its final letters, written in haste, pleas for aid to the Hittites and Egyptians, describing enemy ships already at the harbor. No help came. The fires consumed the port, the palace, the temples. Ugarit was never rebuilt. Its trade network, critical to the flow of tin and copper, vanished overnight. Hattusa, the empty capital, section 1180 BC. In the highlands of Anatolia, the Hittite capital Hattusa, modern Boğazköy, Turkey, faced a different fate. Surrounded by mountains, it was safe from seaborne attack, but not from starvation. Letters suggest the outer provinces stopped sending tribute. Grain shipments from the south dried up. Internal rebellions flared, and foreign powers, possibly the Kaska tribes from the north, took advantage. By 1180 BC, the city was abandoned. The gates stood open, the palaces stripped. The empire that once rivaled Egypt was gone. Mycenae, the fallen citadel, 1190 to 1180 BC. In Greece, the Mycenaean palatial system began to unravel. Fortresses like Mycenae, Kyrens, and Pylos, modern-day Peloponnese, had survived for centuries, their massive walls inspiring the term Cyclopean. But walls couldn't stop famine or civil strife. Evidence suggests some palaces were burned from within, hinting at rebellion or political coups. The collapse of Mycenaean trade meant no more bronze. Warriors were forced to use inferior weapons, leaving them vulnerable to raids. By the early 12th century BC, the palaces were ruined, and Greece entered a dark age that would last centuries. The chain reaction. As each major hub fell, its neighbors suffered. With Ugarit gone, Eastern Mediterranean trade routes broke apart. Without Hattusa, the northern overland connections to the Black Sea collapsed. With the Mycenaeans crippled, Aegean maritime security evaporated. This was the fatal flaw of the Late Bronze Age's interconnected system. Its strength was also its weakness. Once the chain broke, every link was doomed. The collapse spreads, circa 1177 BC. By the year 1177 BC, the list of fallen powers was staggering. The Hittite Empire erased from the map. The Mycenaean palaces abandoned or destroyed. The Canaanite city-states burned, rebuilt, and burned again. Even Egypt, though surviving the Sea Peoples, emerged scarred and weakened. What had been a vibrant web of trade and diplomacy was now a patchwork of struggling, isolated communities. A system that killed itself. Some historians now argue that the collapse wasn't just caused by outside forces, it was baked into the system itself. The Late Bronze Age thrived on specialization and interdependence. When times were good, this meant efficiency and prosperity. But when times turned bad, no single state could stand alone. In a sense, the world ended not because of one disaster, but because the system could not survive without every part working perfectly. By the dawn of the 12th century BC, the great powers were gone. In their place were scattered villages, ruins, and memories of a world that once was. Writing systems disappeared. Monumental architecture ceased. And for the next 4 centuries, much of this region would live in a shadow, the so-called Dark Age. But was it truly dark? Or did something new quietly begin to grow in the ashes? In Part 5, we'll explore the aftermath, the centuries of silence, the loss of knowledge, and the lessons this collapse still holds for us today. History may not repeat itself, but the late Bronze Age collapse whispers a warning we would be wise to hear. Subscribe to Obscure Truths so you won't miss the final chapter, and the moment when the past and present suddenly feel much too close. Part 5. The Dark Age and the Lesson for Us. And then, silence. The song stopped. The palaces stood empty. For centuries, the world forgot what it once was. But was this truly an age of darkness, or the beginning of something new? If you've traveled with us through the fall of Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, and the great Bronze Age powers, you've seen the golden web unravel thread by thread. Now we step into the aftermath, a world stripped bare. And a lesson that echoes across 3,000 years, the long silence, c. 1150 to 750 BC. After 1177 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East entered what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. What followed is often labeled the Dark Age, a term that conjures images of chaos, ignorance, and decline. And yes, much was lost. Writing systems vanished in many regions. The linear B script of Mycenaean Greece disappeared, not to return for centuries. Monumental architecture ceased. No new palaces rose to replace the ones burned. Trade networks collapsed. The busy ports of Cyprus, the Levant, and the Aegean became quiet or turned inward. In Greece, this dark period lasted until the rise of the city-states. Athens, Sparta, around the 8th century BC. In Anatolia and the Levant, small successor states emerged, but none matched the power or reach of their predecessors. Life in the ashes. What was it like to live through this silence? In the ruins of Pylos, modern Peloponnese, Greece, families built makeshift huts within the burned palace walls. In Canaan, modern Israel and Palestine, survivors gathered into fortified hilltop towns, defensible but isolated. Without long-distance trade, communities relied almost entirely on local resources. Technology regressed. Fewer bronze weapons, more stone tools. Pottery became simpler, less decorated. Even diets changed. Less exotic spices, more basic grains and legumes. Cultural amnesia. Perhaps the most haunting loss was cultural memory. In Greece, generations grew up without reading or writing. The epics of earlier times survived only in oral tradition. Myths blurred with history. By the time writing returned, around the 8th century BC with the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet, the people telling the stories no longer remembered them as history, but as legend. This is how the Trojan War, if it happened, became the Iliad, how the fall of palaces became the tales of angry gods and heroic kings, seeds beneath the soil. But here's the twist, even in darkness, seeds were growing. In Levantine cities like Tyre and Sidon, modern Lebanon, seafaring traditions survived, eventually giving rise to the Phoenicians, masters of trade and exploration. In Greece, oral traditions preserved values of heroism, honor, and cunning, later fueling the cultural explosion of the Classical Age. In Israel, this period saw the early formation of kingdoms that would shape the region's spiritual and political history for millennia. The Dark Age wasn't an absolute void. It was a time of adaptation, of slow rebuilding. A mirror for our time. What can we learn from the Late Bronze Age collapse? It wasn't one disaster, but a combination. Climate change, natural disasters, economic fragility, migration, war. No single blow was fatal, but together, they were unstoppable. Our modern world, too, is deeply interconnected. Trade routes span oceans, economies rely on distant suppliers, political stability depends on global cooperation. Like the Bronze Age powers, we are strong when the system works, but vulnerable when it doesn't. The warning: the lesson is not that collapse is inevitable. It's that resilience must be built before the crisis. Diversity of resources, adaptability in trade, systems that can endure shocks. Because history may not repeat exactly, but it often rhymes. Final words. The late Bronze Age world believed it was eternal. It lasted centuries, survived wars, thrived in trade and diplomacy. And then, in a matter of decades, it was gone. We are the inheritors of those who rebuilt from the ashes. If we listen closely, the ruins of Ugarit, the empty gates of Hattusa, the silent walls of Mycenae still whisper, what happened to us could happen to you. If you've walked this journey with us through all 5 parts, thank you. Subscribe to Obscure Truths to keep exploring the forgotten stories of our past, because sometimes the most important truths are the ones buried deepest in time.